are not always the best. So
Okay. I understand that. Let me do some quick adjustments on my end here. I think that'd be good. Okay, good. Do you want to turn your webcam on, or is that okay, or no? Or
oh, is it not on? Oh, sorry.
no problem.
It's like we've got
Oh, there
cam issues, we've got
you
acoustic
go.
issues.
It's okay. I actually use this making notes. Like I need to update my intro policies. I have some
Yeah.
notes just so that. But
Yeah.
well, it's good to meet you, Peter Olson. Is it okay if I call you Peter?
Yeah, Peter's great.
Okay, cool. Um, yes, I'm not sure if you heard an episode or so before.
Yeah, I've heard the past few. I've heard the Simon de Laurent and
Hmm.
wait, Simon Laurent. There's no day in there, right?
No, no, just Saint Laurent. Yeah.
Yeah, and then Dan Jurgens, which is that was pretty cool to hear him.
Uh,
And then the woman who talked about accessibility and the accessibility standards, whose
oh,
name is now
yeah,
escaping me.
yeah, Glenda
Yeah,
Sims. Yeah, she's awesome.
the good witch, the good
Yes,
accessibility witch.
yeah. So she's amazingly positive all the time. It's amazing.
Yeah,
So it's a good spokesperson for accessibility.
yeah.
So, but thank you for being on the show, and I'm gonna count that as a fan of the show. I'm just gonna just put it out there. But yeah, so I saw you on Twitter a while back when you launched the Marvel API,
Hmm.
and I thought it was amazing. It's cool. So I've been following you ever since,
Oh wow.
and then the Simpsons, your Scorpio.
Yeah, Hank Scorpio is
Hank
my
Scorpio.
avatar. Yeah.
Twitter avatar. You sold me on that one. I was like, I'm following this guy. This is great. And yeah, so I just want to catch up with you and talk about. Well, one thing we kind of ask everyone on the show is like how they get involved with the web. What was your first impression? What were you doing? What? So, what was your first impression of the web? Like, how did you find out about it? And,
I was in college. So, I started college in '93, and the web obviously existed a little bit prior to that, but I guess probably after my sophomore year was when it's really was starting to propagate pretty heavily into the the minds of everybody at the time, and I don't know what the first website I ever saw was. It might have been just something like Yahoo back in its days when they were attempting to manually index everything and categorize it. And I remember a few things. Like we would use it to actually find. Like walkthroughs of games or things that could unlock things in games. And like one of the things that, like prior to that, like a bunch of us would do things like modem connections into BBSs and things like that, where you would have, text-based or minimal, graphical user interfaces and you're doing kind of a one-to-one connection to hopefully local telephone number that, to download or whatever. And, or even like way back in the day, my family had like I think it was the Source account, not so like a competitor, not CompuServe, but the competitor to CompuServe.
wow, I didn't even know they had competitors. Wow.
Yeah, they had a handful of them, and so we did that type of engagement. And my parents are academics, and so we were able to get on to like email and listservs and stuff like that. But like even before I was in college, but like it was in college where it was just kind of starting to take off as something that was like getting outside of academic and research circles and into like the college campuses and all of that. And I think probably the first site I ever made was I was on the rowing team in college, and I was never a great rower, but I did know how to do. I was pretty good at picking up, technology and graphic design software and things like that. And so I did a first official site for the rowing team from my school. And it was it was just after, I remember like the standard changed so that there was a day when you couldn't put a background image, and then there was a day you could, and it could tile. And so it was like, people within the school and outside were like, "Oh, I did this. You can actually put an image on the background, and it can tile, and you can make And there was a lot of effort at the time making sure that it tiled just right,
Nice.
So um, yeah, and so I mean, when I graduated, it was still something that was like beginning to be a really burgeoning, field for media expression and also as a career. So I kind of was able to get in right at the beginning in certain ways, at least in terms of it being like a commercial endeavor or something you could actually go and make a living on.
Cool. And so where did you go to college?
It's called Wesleyan University in Connecticut.
Okay. And what did you study?
I was a double major in neuroscience and studio art, so there wasn't
So
a lot of class overlap, but
I like there'd be very minimal class overlap. I mean,
yeah.
so how that is very cool. How did you come to that? What drove you to do those two majors?
Um, there's a few things. I mean, I had always like I studied neuroscience, so I know that this analogy is actually totally bogus science, but I have always done left brain and brain things, and so like I'd always done throughout like even high school and I think even still today things that involve like analytics, understanding scientific rigor, building, working with the kind of science and building and analytical part of the brain, but also things that were expressive at one level or another. So, when I went to school, I was really, really interested in neuroscience, and I thought I was going to go into film, but I took a class in architecture my first semester, and really fell, in love with doing architecture as kind of an expressive medium. And I was literally like, I came in as like, this is the hardest I've ever worked on anything in my life, uh, you know, and really just wanted to just wish I could put more work into it and more work into it. And so so architecture was a concentration within the art department. So I was just like, I'm gonna do this. And my parents were also like, "You're not going to come out of school with an art degree." So and I also was really interested in neuroscience. I mean, one of the reasons I actually chose the school is because I had a great neuroscience and behavior program, which kind of balanced biology and psychology. So I went in on both of them, and I did my thesis in art and architecture, but my a lot of my course, I sort of balanced a lot of like science and art classes, and it was a liberal arts school, so you're kind of supposed to do that anyway. And so like I would have a semester of like half the time in like the architecture or sculpture studio, and the other half the time like in organic chemistry lab, doing both of those. And actually, when I took organic chemistry, my architecture and sculpture training really helped because half of organic chemistry is actually visualizing the shape of molecules in 3 dimensions. And so there were like soft overlaps, if not formal academic and pedagogical ones. So,
So a little bit helped out there. Okay.
yeah.
So yeah, that's one thing I love about the web is that you have to be creative in expression, but also it requires an analytical brain to do a lot of the background, even more so now, I would say, like,
Yeah.
more so. So yeah, cool. So do you feel like it's paid off, like, like you actually work in your college education, if not like directly, but like it's helped you.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say too, I mean, definitely like the art degree or the art side of it, I was learning what at the time was kind of new and upcoming technologies like Photoshop and Illustrator. And so there was, as well as to some degree, like the learning HTML and things like that. I mean, I would say more broadly, going to a school like that where a lot of what you try and do is figure out how to solve problems rather than coming out with like a very specific kind of trade craft. Like it wasn't like some places where you'll go and like you'll do pre-med or you'll do business and you learn a lot of specific skills. A lot of like the takeaway is like actually how do you attack really large complex problems, which is something that kind of over the course of my career I've had to do in different capacities. So I think more importantly than like, do I use neuroscience on a regular basis? Probably not. Although, every once in a while I'll come back and like get inspired by it or something like that. One of the projects we did at Marvel that me and one of my inventors on that we got a patent for was actually inspired by what they call RIFLIP or restriction fragment link polymorphism tests in DNA. So basically it's a way of like pseudo-randomly splitting DNA chunks so you can do DNA fingerprints. And we did something similar with large image files and ended up getting a little patent over it. I think we never actually implemented the thing we were going to do it for, but we're like, oh, we could do this. And I don't think anyone's ever tried this before. So it was inspired. Biology and neuroscience can sometimes be a real interesting source of inspiration, even if it's not like, even I'm not like spending time in a lab or anything like that.
Okay. Would it take too long for you to decode that patent and tell me what it does, and then in my broken English, I guess?
Oh yeah, it was pretty. It was just a way. It was a way we were like we were looking at ways of potentially protecting. And one of the big challenge with media companies, when this is when I was at Marvel, is making sure people are having enough security around things that you can keep the honest people honest, but not investing so much time in it that you're just getting into these arms races that are not really productive, and just you're spending more money trying to build security versus actually building products that help consumers. So this is a way of like kind of making a light level of security around things around the front end of content delivery on the front end without like in creating a really heavy DRM, but also making it so essentially what it would do is like in DNA, you apply what's called a restriction enzyme, which, DNA's got this 4-letter vocabulary, right? So it goes, A, T, G, C, A, T, whatever. A restriction enzyme will look for a sequence of letters within a strand of DNA, and wherever if you throw it against a particular strand of DNA, wherever it just happens to hit these letters, it will yank them out. And so you get these fragments of DNA of varying length. And then from those, and that signature of the fragments is what they use to do genetic fingerprinting, right? So one person, they'll pull it out on a piece of gel, and you'll see like longer and shorter fragments, in there. And that's what a DNA fingerprint does. Similarly, what we would do is essentially convert say like an image file or a sound file or something like that, and encode it in whatever encoding, like base 64 or something like that, create a random sequence of letters that existed within the letter space of whatever encoding you're doing, and then use that to just chunk the file and break it into different things, and then extract that key whenever it was found. So like a 2-megabyte file or a smaller file might break out into a bunch of little chunks. So you send the chunks and then reassemble it on the client side using the key that isn't shared at the time. So it's just a light way of protecting assets. They're not like very easily assemblable, but very quickly reassembled, like in an application or on the web.
Okay.
So,
all right, I'm gonna have to listen to this a couple times. But we on tape now. Okay. Cool. Awesome. Well, I think getting a patent is pretty awesome. So
yeah,
that's pretty. Do you have any other patents?
I got 2 while I was at Marvel. One was around the digital comics viewer that we launched. Actually, we launched it way back. The one that we submitted the patent for was back in 2006, and then that one. So I've got 2. I mean, okay. It doesn't really mean much. It's sort of funny. Like one interesting part. Like I was on and the patent committee at Marvel and Disney for the Disney patent committee at Marvel, and I was also on the Disney open source committee. So I was like looking at the problem of IP from both sides while I was there. But it was cool because it gave me a kind of wide understanding of like, you know, how does it, when does it make sense for a company to open source? Like, when is it best to participate in, say, open standards bodies, like which, and in like we participated in some stuff with schema.org and the semantic web stuff that there, and then, you know, when does it make sense to kind of maybe hold something closer? And I think software patents are a whole minefield, but there are some, you know, there's sometimes reasons where a company might want to do it. But yeah, like but yeah, so it's sort of like looking at things you make and like how can you actually use them in a variety of ways, and actually and how does it actually help you? And one thing I'm still very curious in and try and help, you know, both IDEO and other clients we work with now is like, how do we actually, you know, we've made this thing, how do we actually use it, disseminate it, and have it do even more broad impact through the use of either open sourcing or creating open APIs or data marketplaces, or make it be impactful beyond just creating the thing, but actually getting a lot of impact after the fact, you know.
Right. So I guess I never really thought about Disney being open source or having an open source culture, I guess it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it there? I mean, is it kind of like, I have no idea. Is there a website I could look up more about that? Or
I don't know if there's a centralized one. Different business units kind of handle it differently. I know, like, if you go to I think ESPN has a GitHub page, and Disney Animation has actually done quite a lot. And Marvel, we contributed to things individually, but it wasn't like I don't think we ever released anything. But yeah, I mean, there definitely was an open source committee that I was on, and, you know, like thinking about kind of how it could be used throughout the company, and it was a pretty broad. I mean, it's like a lot of committees, it's a big, broad remit, you know. But yeah, if you look like, I know Disney Animation has actually done quite a bit. So
cool, yeah. You know, no offense to Disney, but just like I don't really find that they'd be great. IP big. I'm pretty sure. Like I just feel like they wouldn't be too dedicated to open source technologies a lot. But not to say that's bad. Just saying that's what it is. So so this is you mentioned Marvel. So I mean, but I do want to mention like how did you get started in a web career? So what were your first gigs or first jobs? And
sure, yeah. I mean, so when I graduated college, I, you know, like I said, I kind of concentrated my art stuff into architecture, and I was like, I really want to go into architecture. And then I went to work for this really interesting, great architect, and I came out loving architecture more, but realizing it wasn't what I wanted to do professionally. And so,
why is that?
I think there was a lot of things. I think like there was, you know, just looking at kind of the hours and the business model and all of that, like, it was, and kind of how, both like kind of how difficult it is to come up and get to the point where you can be really expressive at it. You know, I think it's the same thing that happened to a lot of things with the advent of the web, is that your ability to be creative and amplify and publicize that was democratized in a lot of ways. And it's very difficult for that same kind of process to happen in architecture. I mean, it'd be interesting now with the advent of 3D printing and things like that, if that's the case. But, you know, to make a building, you need capital, and you need a patron, or you need a big company or a hospital chain or something to help you realize that. And then you have to also convince them that it is in their interest, you know, from a business and space perspective to get that building built. And there was a time, you know, the architect I worked for is named Peter Eisen, and he's written a lot of he's like, it was the type of thing, like I was studying him in some of my classes, and then I graduated, and 6 months later I was working for him. And it was really kind of an amazing experience. But he one of the things he wrote about is how architecture used to be, maybe a few hundred years ago, the way you presented yourself to the world. And now we have a variety of media by which you can do that. So whether, it used to be you would, oh, I'm going to take over this country and build a bunch of cathedrals to show how powerful I am. And now you do an ad campaign. So, it's probably a little more cost effective and timely. So, we, so, and at the same time, I was watching and seeing how the web was really exploding, here in New York and all over the world, and how it was this great engine for communication, for supporting subcultures, for taking anyone who has an idea and being able to amplify it in really interesting ways. And I felt like it was, to me, like that was really exciting. So, I started out just like literally just doing freelance work. And then I went to, an early kind of this was kind of the early high heroic period of the dot-com boom, so, and I went to a company that did, they managed a handful of web properties. So some of them were things like, kind of more general entertainment sites, but we also did a lot of, kind of official celebrity websites. So we did like Cindy Crawford's first site, which was interesting. We did Britney Spears' first site. And then from there, I went to another startup that was basically a community site for teenagers. And that was a really amazing experience, partially because it made me really interested in how the web can be used to build and support communities. And also, like, that age group was so just absorptive of that technology, and kind of building and communicating and speaking in a way that, like, I think had not really even seen, even by my generation. I wasn't that much older than them, than our audience in a lot of ways. But I think, like, you could tell there was a fairly bright line of the people who were like growing up with the web versus the people like maybe my age that were discovering it like in post-secondary education. So I think that's working at that place, which is also, long gone with the dot-com boom, but was a really was very eye-opening for me. It showed me sort of how communities can exist at scale, and how to build and foster communities. And both at Marvel and now at IDEO, it's something that the ability of modern day technology to kind of work at scale, to spread information, to build subcultures, sometimes maybe in negative ways now. It has always been very interesting to me, and being able to facilitate that and was something I've always been interested in. So, like, yeah.
In what ways has technology did you see, or you implemented, like, with the younger generation, and
Mm-hmm.
like what things worked in terms of scaling with technology? How did that work out? Like, what did you guys do? Yes.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that we glommed onto, which was at the time, now is so foundational we don't even think about it, but at the time was an emerging thing, which was like the rapid growth of SMS. And so we were, it was primarily a website, but we built a lot of hooks into SMS, and we were seeing like, and it kind of hit Europe a little before the United States, but like there was some statistic quoted at the time, and this is a while back, so forgive me if it's slightly wrong now, but like the rate at when SMS, and when it was still kind of a pay per message or pay per bundle of message service in Europe, the smoking rate amongst teens in the UK dropped significantly because they were spending their money to text instead of to buy cigarettes. Like,
oh wow. Okay.
So there were things like that where you were seeing new modes of communication, and this is also the era where, like, say something like AOL Instant Messenger was starting to pop up, but like all these new modes of like group and one-to-one communication, different modalities of like whether it's a asynchronous thing on a message board or it's a synchronous group chat, all of these new modes of communication were just kind of exploding into the general populace, and were also being really sucked up by, particularly, at least in this instance, the teens of that site. And this was 99 to 2001 that I was there, and we had upwards of like 5 million users when I left, which at the nowadays is like, oh well, Facebook's got the entire country of China size user base. But like at the time, it was a pretty like it was a very it showed sort of the potential that these things had. It's just at the time also there the bottom dropped out of the business market at the time for that, and things like there wasn't really the ad market or the economies of scale you get now for infrastructure, that like there wasn't the equivalent of AWS or Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure that you could just really scale up to the cost. So there was, I think, and that caused the bottom to drop out of that whole sector for a few years. But the impact that you could have at that time, which I still think is largely, you still can actually have this great impact at scale through these technologies, was pretty incredible to me. And the fact that like you could say have a site that whose content was almost entirely generated by teenagers, and who then had like a way of expressing themselves that heretofore had never had, is pretty amazing. I think it's one of these things even today, like we get so technology is so foundational to what we do, we forget how amazing it is sometimes. It's like the Louis C.K. everything's amazing, and everything's amazing and nobody's happy. Like, forget, like, you can be a kid writing a blog on Tumblr today, and you can become a major media celebrity, or at least a minor media celebrity, because of, and people who would normally not be able to engage with the kind of regular media landscape are able to kind of become famous, whether it's through Tumblr or Instagram or Snapchat stories or what have you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I definitely. I see what you're saying with that. Just with that, I mean, just like there's my hometown football player at the local college sat with a kid with disabilities,
Mm-hmm.
who's by himself during lunchtime.
Yeah.
And he's not in. It was like his favorite, because no one sits with him
Yeah.
at lunchtime, and so he had this great lunchtime. And he came home, and he has a photo, and someone snapped a photo of it.
Mm-hmm.
He came home, mom loved it. It made local news.
Yeah.
And now it's like a whole viral and went to a location, right?
Yeah.
And so, and now he goes to the team, games now. He's on the sidelines now and everything. So it's pretty awesome. And like he wouldn't have that without that viral. It wouldn't have made local newspapers. If it would have made the national Good Morning America. What have you. So I was just like, whoa, crazy.
Yeah.
So yeah, I get that too. But also, my beef with the Louis C.K. thing is that I would be glad to travel airplanes in the 1960s where they feed you real food.
Yeah.
Now it's like, let me use some peanuts here.
Exactly. We're looking at it through a relative lens, and really the expectations are ramping up, and the ability for them to serve are sometimes not keeping up with that. So
yeah, it's like also the switch up comedians, also like Tina Fey, which is like when people clap when they land the plane. I was like all the passengers on the flight, when they clap.
Yeah.
It's like, why are you clapping? It's supposed to land. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Someone is doing their job. It's like parking someone's car or something like that, or
Yeah,
parking.
say, well, I parked your car. Like, good job. Like, oh, thank
Yeah,
you. All right. Yeah. So it's all relative, basically,
yeah,
as you said before. Cool. Yeah. And also, I'm really negative about that sort of thing. Sorry. But yeah. So what we'll talk about now is just okay. I guess I was gonna just step into it. Like, how did you get into Marvel? That's like because Mark Wade always said that. I think it was Mark Wade said like, there's always one way to get into comics, and you just and once you find it that way is always paved over, and you can
yeah.
never go back.
Yeah. I mean, I started working for Marvel, and and to be clear, I worked in their digital media group. I didn't, ever, I didn't have any real involvement in the creative side of the comics. Although, it's a smaller company than I think a lot of people realize. So there's always a lot of, conversations there. But yeah, I started there in 2004, and it was actually it's one of these really boring things. Like there was an ad on the internet, and I applied.
Oh wow, that's awesome.
But it was kind of a cool. At the time, it was a really cool opportunity because they were at through the .com boom. They had grown their digital media capabilities, and then kind of after that crashed, they cut that back really severely, and they felt, I think, a little burned out of it. And this was, it's hard to think of Marvel back then the way with the kind of cultural weight it has now. Like they were still at the time basically in their post bankruptcy period, so they were 5 years out of being bankrupt, in Chapter 11 or whatever a chapter equivalent that is, for big businesses, and they were very focused on just how can we operate as leanly as we possibly can. So when I was brought on, there was maybe one or two other people in the whole company thinking and working on digital, and my remit was basically like, okay, in about 6 weeks, Spider-Man 2 is going to come out. Can you redesign our site and rebuild it? I'm like, oh, sure. And so we were able to do that, and to some degree handle the traffic from the movie release. And then, we got through that period, and then we're just kind of like, how do we actually, we feel that there's a huge opportunity for Marvel in this, in the digital space, because they just weren't thinking about it. The web, there were games and things like that, but there was, basically, the web group was me and part-time 3 other people or something like that. And so I just was sort of like, it's almost like kind of being like sort of like a startup founder, but also in the part of a larger company, and you have this well-known brand and things like that. So we started working on features and pushing different things out. Like I think the one thing that early on, which now seems like really kind of dated and a little bit of a no-brainer, I was just like, let's do wallpaper. Let's just like every week when the new comics are coming out, we'll do wallpaper of half the covers and put it out. And we made a production process around it. And one thing I learned really quickly was how to make really efficient processes, because it would be kind of, it was either me doing it or like an intern doing it. And so we had to like, anything we had, like it wasn't automated and there weren't like really great, off the shelf CMSs at the time, it was just like, doing a lot of process design and engineering was actually a decent chunk of the job.
So what are your tips for building efficient processes?
I would say one is, do only as many actions as you absolutely have to do. So like if you're doing a bundle of things, like, at the time we might do like, have to kind of crop out, 20 photos, 20 covers at the time, from a portrait to a landscape or a widescreen view, and figure out how to reduce those as much as possible and make it as simple as possible assume very minimal knowledge on the part of the person doing it. So like there were times some of the processes we did for later on for digital comic production was a lot of it was like actually writing scripts in the Adobe scripting languages that could handle it. So like it required just someone hitting a button as opposed to doing 5 steps within a thing. So, but yeah, like we, you know, and then from that, after that, like kind of over a summer, I was working with this intern, and we're like, it sucks that you can't come to Marvel.com and read a comic online. You know? So, and we're just like, what if we just do this? What if we build it, you know, build like a method to do it? Because like we could get the art files if we needed through just Marvel's, you know, digital asset management. And we're just like, how would we do this? And we basically kind of were like, we're going to spend the summer and we're going to figure this out. And so over the summer, we built, you know, what became the digital comics reader for Marvel.com, and then the process to back it up, and worked with, you know, the publishing group there to figure out like how could we actually put these out initially as marketing and then build a business around it. And that was kind of like what is now Marvel Unlimited. That's kind of how it started, with like 2 of us sitting in a windowless office at Marvel, being like, let's do this. Let's, you know, we built the whole thing in Flash in like 3 months at least. And, you know, and it's obviously completely different product now, right. A totally different scale of business, but like that's kind of the type of thing we were able to do. Is like at the time it was just like, this is something we should you would think would be here. Let's do it. And at the time there wasn't really no comic publisher had ever leaned into digital distribution in a really serious way. Mm-hmm. You know, you could do things like you could buy CDs with like PDFs of comics, or you could buy, you know, BitTorrent was starting to rear its head, and so you could get stuff illegally, but like nothing, there were no one was ever like, no publishers were like really saying like, how can we take this seriously? And it took, you know, kind of like a demo and a prototype to show that we could create a good experience around it, and we could, you know, start to drive interest in it, and then ultimately turn that into a product that, you know, people would support commercially. So it was, you know, it was one of those things. It was a moment where we just needed to, like, someone needed to do it, and it turned out Marvel was in the best position, even with this really skeletal crew at the time, right, to do it. And then, you know, this is the type of thing, like, as it started, that started to grow, and Marvel as the whole, you know, as an organization got more and more prominent, and they started to invest more and more in the group, and so it's sort of the group grew, you know, laterally, it grew above me, it grew below me, and, you know, but like, you know, that type of thing, especially, you know, kind of pervaded through the whole time I was there, but especially in the early days when we were just like, we're trying to discover and explore how this can be really valuable to Marvel as a company, and value, something that can really bring a lot of value to our fans. You know, it just took people like sitting down and it's like, we're going to do this and let's figure it out, you know?
Right. Yeah. It takes someone who wants the ownership of it. Right. So
yeah,
that's important. So,
yeah.
Cause I'm not sure what year was this, or what time frame was this, you know?
I'm trying to think that was probably like 2005. We did the work in the summer of 2005. And then like Marvel Digital Comics, and we launched a variety of digital comics, like as essentially as like a long pilot between like the fall of 2005 and the fall of 2007. So like we were kind of building up the site generally at the time, and we did things like going back to the communities, like we knew we had this great avid fan base, so we did things like created a character wiki, which is I think still there, and at the time was, you know, the time I was there was always like kind of the #1 feature of the site, in terms of traffic, pretty
Right.
substantial portion of the traffic, because like ultimately that's what people care about. And I think that was another kind of brave thing for Marvel to do, was just like, we're going to turn over the online presence of our characters to the fans, because they know it best, and they could. And then it was a way also, again, we could scale with a relatively small staff uh, to support, to get bios of characters that we wouldn't really be able internally to have the staff to write. So like
Right.
the fans were engaged and could keep up with it a lot better than we could internally, and they often, frankly, know the backstory better than, maybe not like every edit, like Tom Brevoort knows everything about Marvel, but like people, at least in the digital side, they would often know it better, and we built out other community things. Like I think coming from like building communities and subcultures from teens, I was able to apply that to helping build products, and supporting the subculture of fans. And at the same time, we built out things like the digital comics products. So when we launched Marvel Digital Comics Unlimited, that mutated into Marvel Unlimited a few years later. Um, a lot of it was that was kind of in the context of a lot of other activity that was going around on the site at the time. And obviously, we were doing stuff that helped support, just the sales and marketing of our comics, the sales and marketing of the movies and the television shows, and anything else to push the company. One thing that a digital group at a company like Marvel, and it's probably not unique to Marvel, but definitely we felt it there, is that like oftentimes it becomes like the horizontal for all the verticals,
Yeah.
and it's the thing that kind of can help glue together these things in a really intentional and cool way. And that was something that we definitely felt, there. So
Right. Yeah, and I feel like turning over the characters to wiki is great, because I feel like I'm not a big Marvel fan. I mean, I'm going to say up front, but I'm a DC Comics guy, which
yeah.
is, I'm sorry, but it's just that one of the cool things I love about DC is that the who's who
Hmm.
portion of it, and that just goes
Yeah.
back into the Wikipedia, the Marvel Universe, where they just catalog everything, and they actually,
Yeah.
take the brain power, brain trust, and that's a lot of time and effort on their own creators' hands, and they have to pay their own creators and
Yeah.
creatives to actually build those things out and to turn it wiki over and to the fans. I think it's just a
Mhm.
very smart move on Marvel's part. So that's, if not in terms of financial, and also creative too, to get the community involved. So it's just
Yeah.
pretty awesome. And so,
Well, one thing I think Marvel always did pretty well was try and stay engaged with the fans. I mean, even back in the age of Stan and Jack, they would write letters, and Stan Lee would write back to you. And there's some great ones if you go through the archives that people have found. Like George R. R. Martin wrote to, I think it was Stanley, but he wrote a letter to the about the Avengers, to there, and you can see how that level of engagement has pervaded in Marvel and others, and I think it's extended to the way we at the time presented ourselves on the website, and the way embraced social media in different ways as well.
yeah, and that's one thing I miss about comics back in, like, when I get it, was like, before the internet,
Mhm.
people would write letters, and the editor would
Yeah,
take the letters,
yeah,
and so you get this nice, obviously handpicked letters about the past issues,
yeah,
but you also, depending on the editor, they would get you hints of what's coming, what's the back
yeah,
door, and then with Marvel, it was also, you get the I know it was named the bullpen all the time, but it was like
yeah,
a letter from the editor. So, and sometimes it's be Stan Lee or Jim Shooter or
yeah,
whatever. So it was always great. And now with I felt like I loved email, but when people would be able to email editors,
yeah,
and then the cost of paper, I guess, for the book,
yeah,
they stopped doing the email, the letters in the back. The comics, I just, oh man, just, if a little piece of me died. So
yeah.
it's like, that's not what a comic book is, man. But so talk about, we talk about, like, who's who and Marvel Universe.
Yeah.
I think there's some great presentations you've done that are online about I guess the Marvel API. Is that right? Is that what What's
Yeah.
what would be something else?
Well, someone, I think, Fast Company called it the Uber framework,
Yeah.
and it got like kind of expanded a little more. Like it's not something we ever called. So one of the things, as I was at Marvel longer and longer, one of the things we found that was, challenging is kind of dealing with the scale of, Marvel had been telling stories since 1939. This giant soap opera that's been running. And so, and this isn't unique to comic universes, but I'm sure like DC and Marvel, it's probably one of the more complicated ones because these stories run for crazy longs. Like if you look at the Tolkien universe, at a certain point it stops. Frodo leaves the plane and goes off to see the Valar or whatever, and Marvel and DC and other big comic universes keep going. Even the Star Wars universe, like until the new movies have stopped, right? It's like anything, even like stuff like the Clone Wars cartoon was kind of pre-filling, up to the episode 4 and or episode 3, I guess it's all between 2 and 3, but and so that created this huge challenge of how do we actually represent this, and it was sort of two things, like one kind of how do we make sense of it, and how can we ultimately make sense to our fans, both from presenting stories and grouping things in a coherent way, in a way that's understandable, and also reaching different audiences. So like a mom or a dad who has a young kid who's really into Spider-Man may not care about the nuances of Miles Morales Spider-Man versus Ultimate Peter Parker Spider-Man versus Spider-Man in the 616 universe versus Spider-Man, and all of that. They just want to have Spider-Man stuff, whereas many fans are very interested, like, I just want to know about Miles, or I want to know about, the core Marvel Universe Spider-Man. And then even within a storytelling universe, you have like the example I've given a lot is Hawkeye, where he started out as a villain, then he became Hawkeye, then he was Goliath for a while, then he was Hawkeye again, then he was dead, then he was Ronin, then he was Hawkeye, and then there's other characters who've assumed the mantle of Hawkeye and things like that. And the way we had up until that point, just as a company, modeled that stuff was fairly statically. So there's this thing called Hawkeye in the database, and we found that there needed to be a much more nuanced way of doing that. So we kind of started to tease it apart, and we found that like using graph theory was kind of the only way to do it. So we looked, graph. I had never studied that in college, like that kind of particular branch of math and computer science, and I kind of came across it like looking at just like how do you approach this problem, and it turned out to be a really great fit for modeling this very complex and shifting universe. And so
how would you describe graph theory?
I mean, it's a very, at its core, it's pretty straightforward. It's and simple. You break things out into things and their relationships. Like you look at you break things out, and they could be people, they could be entities of different types, and you look at how they relate to each other. Mm-hmm. And it kind of turns traditional data modeling on its head a little bit, which is like if I'm creating like a schema in like MySQL or PostgreSQL or something like that. A lot of the time, and I'd been in business conversations where this happened a lot. Like people get very like focused in on like what is is this a string? Is it a number? Is this property? This and get very very you get very focused on like the details of properties of things, and then you'll say, oh well, that relates to this and this relates to that, and so looking at things with a graph perspective, you look at how things relate primarily, and a lot of these you see the lines with like circles and lines connecting everything. And what's interesting about it is there's been so much work done against it, and it really had I mean, it'd been around as a theory for a long time. I can't remember off the top of my head the mathematician who first started to do it, but he was like trying to find ways like, can you cross 7 bridges across a German river and not repeat your path or something like that. But as a with the advent of large, so kind of simultaneously with the advent of the large social media sites, and with Google trying to make the web less strings and more entities, there've been a lot of work in a resurgence in kind of research and understanding of how this works. So the kind of for free thing you get when you start to model information as graphs is a set of very powerful mathematical tools that allow you to analyze it. So it starts out with things like modeling in a traditional database like friends of friends of friends becomes somewhat computationally complex, but in a graph representation is much kind of easier to do. And then things like, who are the big fish in the big pond? Who are the characters that connect in our case, characters that connect to other characters? Like, one thing we found when we started doing this type of analysis, like, so there's a big Marvel universe, right? And then there's a bunch of kind of little satellite ones, like the Ultimate Universe or the Squadron Supreme verse or the there was like a whole universe where like everyone was covered in cancer. It was like all kinds of things like that. And we could see like which characters were actually big connectors between it, or in the main Marvel universe, like which characters became big kind of the glue characters for between the big franchises. And you could even do things like with like a naive clustering algorithm, we were actually like able to tease out all of our franchises without like the algorithm knowing anything about our characters, just by looking at how they relate. So like, how many times has this character appeared in this in a comic with another character, things like that. So this was something where we really kind of leaned in to just understand the intellectual property better, and also even things like, how do we group comics into stories and be able to kind of break out of the periodical structure that is inherent to comics. And so that's like, if you are publishing, comics are kind of organized like magazines, except that like, if you subscribe to like the New Yorker or Cosmo, you get one issue every month, or every week, and number 1 comes after number 2, and at the end of the year there's a new volume, and it's very regular. Comic series kind of appear and disappear fairly frequently. They rename for pretty commonly. They number in strange ways. Like, there was a point at which we had to change our whole data model because they changed comic book numbers from an integer to a float.
Yeah,
because they point ones and point fives and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, no, DC did that with their villain issues, I guess.
Yeah. And then and especially like we live in the age of Netflix and Marvel Unlimited now, right? And so if you're a Marvel Unlimited subscriber, there's thousands or tens of thousands of comics that are available. And maybe the original periodical structure that was published in is not really the best thing in terms of reading a long story. Like, you have a big event, that might have tie-in issues that can help enhance the story. Maybe you just want to follow a character, maybe not even the main character. Like, what if you reorganize all of Spider-Man and just followed Mary Jane throughout it? Something like that. So like, it gave us tools to kind of slice and dice the data, just for some really tactical things of just like, if someone's looking up Spider-Man, can we actually give them comic books that Spider-Man shows up in, to like really interesting new ways of potentially telling these stories. To the extent those have been implemented, who knows? And then towards the end of my time at Marvel, we released the Marvel API, which I thought was a really, again, like, I think it harkens back to the theme of like, we always wanted to make sure our fans were engaged in different ways, and this is just a new way that they could stay engaged, right? Where, and there's some cool stuff like that's been done with like the Wall Street Journal has done all this analysis of like the color usage in the covers using the Marvel API. I have like, if my Twitter background is actually the entire run of like 700 issues of Uncanny X-Men broken down into its colors. So each line is basically one cover kind of condensed into a 16 color single pixel thing. So
That's awesome. Yeah.
yeah.
Cool.
Um,
Well, as a nerd, I am. It's like kind of Rob Gordon from was it High Fidelity, like finding his ultimate record
yeah.
ordering. I find that totally awesome that you can find that and find those relationships because that's one thing that I spent most of my time with with comics growing up was like trying to find ordering everything and documenting everything, and then then some publisher comes up with a point one
Yeah.
system, and you're like screwed. Like
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it's also like the they do these things for a reason, and sometimes it's a perfectly good reason to signal something to a fan. Like I'm going to renumber Fantastic Four back to issue 1 because a creative team has changed and it's a new storyline. It's a good kind of signal. But when you're looking at it archivally, and the modes of media consumption are changing pretty radically now, and I think people do look at things in an archival way. Like, you binge watch on Netflix. You don't just wait every week for the new episode of something to come out. Some people certainly do still, but it's not the only mode you can do it, and that creates, I think, really big challenges organizationally, which is why we worked with things like creating APIs, creating graph models, working with schema.org. All of those things to help kind of ourselves and our business and also our fans get a better, be able to engage with the product better.
Yeah, I think that's very awesome. Yeah. And so what made you decide but now you're at IDEO,
Yeah.
which is a great company. So how did you choose to go from Marvel to IDEO? Was it different challenges, or was it just?
Yeah, there's a few things. I mean, I'd been at Marvel 10 years, and that's a long time to be anywhere. And the second thing, there's things at IDEO that we're looking at. I'd say one thing I found more and more that I got more and more interested at Marvel was not just how do we make innovative products, but actually how do we change Marvel and Disney to become more innovative. So like I started to look at ways, of not just impacting the things that we were doing, but impacting the organization and culture as itself. And that type of challenge is something that IDEO does now on a regular basis. So it's not just, it's beyond just like products that we design and make, and certainly we make a lot of and design a lot of really cool stuff. But oftentimes we're looking at ways that through the process of design we can have a really, really broad-based impact in the world and inside organizations, and whether that's like explicitly helping an organization, find its purpose or redesign itself, or through the process of designing a product, help them kind of center and reorient around it to support and launch that product. So, so this one thing was kind of like the scope of challenges that like we can really think about and work on here at IDEO has changed, and also like just different kind of materials to work with, material in a very broad sense. So like, one day we might be looking at something that, we're actually working on Arduinos and doing stuff in the physical space, which is just not, something we tended to do at Marvel in the digital media group. And other times we're looking at organization and really highly strategic stuff. And, oftentimes I'm still like working with data and working with APIs and all of that. So there's a broader scope of things. And it's certainly not a diss on Marvel, but definitely a change in kind of the focus and impact I was looking to do with my career. So, it was, it's not easy to leave a company that you've been at and that, leave an organization within the company that you kind of helped build from the ground up. But it was also just like kind of like the right time and a right opportunity. And IDEO is such a interesting, crazy place to work that wanted to, it was a good move to make.
Yeah, I mean, they like just what you're saying, like this different range of projects, keep you interested more so than to work with it. Yeah. So what type of challenge? So, and you've been at the IDEO for a few years now. So,
Yeah.
do you have a team? Like, what's your day to day
uh,
operation like there?
I mean, I feel like day to day is always a loaded term in any
Yeah.
organization, and when like IDEO is crazy. I mean, generally at IDEO, I sort of work on,
Well, I do
yeah,
want to back up a little bit. Let me just
yeah.
set a little bit at the table. According to LinkedIn, your job is a creative technologist, which is an
Yeah.
awesome title. So, so I just want to say, like, what is a day to day job for a creative technologist?
Yeah, it's like I said, it's a loaded term. Yeah, I kind of do a few different things. One is like helping kind of find new clients and new work. So like, figuring out like, are we a good fit for a particular challenge? How can we actually create a project with a client that would be, you know, important for them and fun for us and you know all of that. I work in project teams. So one of the things that's different from IDEO is different from a lot of companies and a lot of even like a lot of other consultancies where a project team at IDEO like works on a project from beginning to end. So it's not like, oh, we bring in the developers at the end or we bring in, a research at the beginning. Like every project team is a kind of interdisciplinary group that is thinking about a problem with their own kind of individual lenses. So like if you have like a team, you might have a team that's like a writer and a design researcher and a software programmer all working together on or as we sometimes call them, software designers, on a particular challenge over, say, 10 to 12 weeks, or sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. I think the top of the bell curve is like 10 weeks. And so you're kind of working in like these little pods from time to time. So I work on project teams and help, particularly with clients that are like undergoing some form of digital transformation or are working on launching a digital product, and oftentimes in some cases like I like where I might have some other expertise, like if there's a media client or something, I'll sometimes work on those, and help work on those project teams to get the to get the project out. I mean, sometimes it's funny. It's like sometimes I'm cutting code and I'm like working across a bunch of different programming languages and getting stuff out the door. Other times it's a lot more like strategic and upstream. Like one of our process. I don't know how if. I guess I should kind of explain what IDEO is because it's like this is going to be a fun editing job of like looping back this conversation into some sort of linear format. But so we're a design consultancy. IDEO was founded in the 80s and like originally did things like Apple's first mouse and Microsoft's first mouse, and now we definitely do things like that as well as digital products, and also look at like how do we make organizations themselves more innovative? How do we make movements happen that can affect society sometimes in interesting ways? So our scope of work goes everything from like how can we create interesting or powerful movements in society down to like let's make this product or make the services that can support a product. Like so we're doing like we'll work on anything from like we have a challenge right now on OpenIDEO, which is one of our kind of public facing innovation crowdsourcing engines around making reducing food waste globally, to things like I worked on an app for everyday fashion earlier this year. So it's like it's all over the place. And so like I've done some work there. Like I've done a certain amount of work actually for the government, making the government more collaborative and making certain parts of the government share knowledge better, which helps us all as taxpayers, hopefully. And other parts are like we're going to be launching. We'll work a project we worked on recently about making New York more resistant to floods. We'll be launching in the next few weeks, probably.
Wow.
So yeah. So that's been pretty cool because it's in our backyard here, and it's it's something that like we you know as part of that, like as part of the design research process for that, we were visiting people who had been affected by Superstorm Sandy, and looking at like kind of how sometimes fragile the New York landscape is, and it gave me a very new perspective on New York. Yeah, and the process or the we use what's called design thinking, which is really just a way of like looking at all of our problems, no matter what the need is, no matter what the client is, from the lens and the understanding the people who are going to be affected by what you build. So whether that's the consumer of an app or someone who might be using a service that we design, or the member of the organization that the tool, the knowledge sharing tool is for, is really understanding and listening and being really one-on-one with them, so that what we design helps them, meets their needs and all of that.
Is that design thinking? Is that what it is? Is that just thinking about in terms of more interaction with the user or consumer, I guess?
Well, it's getting, I guess you could say it's sort of three things. One is like getting empathy and understanding the user. And I think it's the user. And then once you know that, like understand like the business needs of the person, whether that's a nonprofit or a government entity or a for-profit company, like what do they need business and operationally to be able to support this, and what do they need to get out of it, and also what can be done within reasonable technology, today. So a lot of the times I'm kind of looking at all of those, but we always start with we always start with the user, and there's a whole Venn diagram of like, because a lot of the times like you might start with like looking at the technology first, and you could come up with some really great technology, or you might end up with something like Google Glass, which I think is an amazing piece of technology, but had trouble really kind of resonating with consumers and finding a market. And sometimes you'll look at like, a lot of companies will look at the business, like what's going to make us a lot of money, and they'll end up with something that probably may or may not make them money, but is not always, maybe doesn't maximize that because they're not understanding the users who are using it. So like imagine like, ATM fees. They make a lot of fees for banks, but it also hurts their brand and makes them seem colder and less responsive. Or like some car companies or rideshare companies will increase their prices by significant amounts when they're busy, and that's a totally economically rational decision. But then their competitors use it as ads against them. So we always start by like, what do people need, and how can we turn that into designs? And then that's kind of the first step. And then the second step is is building and actually making things, to take the hunches and the insights we've learned from that first step, and prototyping and prototyping and prototyping. We go through a whole process of like prototyping and synthesis and taking the learnings, playing them back, testing them with designs, testing them with prototyping. So it's working very tangibly, as opposed to making a PowerPoint deck and say, go build this, that's also a way of ultimately reducing risk, I think, so like it is fun, and everyone has, it's fun and creative and all that, but it also helps actually, vet ideas quickly and early, and then make sure that they are actually buildable and viable and all of that quick. And also it's a great forcing function. Like it's very easy to say, well, we should build this thing, and then doing a quick prototype says, yeah, maybe not, or maybe we should, or well, let's build it do this and this, and then combine that. So like a lot of, prototypes can be everything from like sketches to fairly robust data-driven things to 3D printed things to for the flood resilience project, we made a VR using a Google Cardboard demo of what your where you're standing using Google Maps and the cardboard and the flood line of Sandy, so you could see like where the tide line would hit where you were, which could help really contextualize the problem to people. And also was like good to get to get people to demos and things like that. You know?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That sounds pretty awesome. I like
Yeah.
that. Sign me up. Where do I go? But cool, awesome. Well, it's I know you probably run off. Do some more. We talked for almost an hour
Oh my gosh.
already. So
It's already been an hour. Oh my gosh.
yeah, So thank you so much for your time. And how can people follow your awesome Twitter avatar?
I know my Twitter name is kind of weird because it's like the result of an inside joke that's lost all meaning. But it's Deahtron 5000, DETHTRON 5000, and you can. It's kind of the same on like every social media platform. So yeah, and I'm excited. I think there's a lot of to me like we live in a time now where like I think there's this explosion of really interesting technologies that can be used in really creative and human-centered ways right now. And that's everything from, VR and AR to the rapid advances we're seeing in machine vision and computer and the kind of broad set cluster of AI technologies. So it's like, I feel like to me, like getting back to the right brain, left brain thing, like that's the thing that like makes me get up and go to work every morning is like we have this opportunity of using technology in a creative way to help humans and to work with humans' needs, and not not necessarily lead with the technology, but become this technology is now a new design material. And to me, like that's like why I get up every day. It's like how do we actually use this stuff in more and more creative ways to help people and to help businesses and to help organizations. So that's where I'm at. That's where my head's at now. So thanks for having me on the show.
Oh man, it's been my pleasure. It's awesome. Great. I'm gonna hit